Fans of the Horus Heresy, thank you very much for joining me for my detailed cover-to-cover book review of the Horus Heresy Book 7, Inferno. So, the latest instalment in Forge World's epic retelling of a saga of the intergalactic civil war between the forces of Horus Lupercal and the Emperor of Mankind. And Book 7, Inferno, deals with the events around the Battle of Prospero, or as it is better known, the Burning of Prospero. So, what I'm going to do in this review is we're going to look at this book and we're going to do a detailed review going from one cover to the other. As we go through the book, I'm going to show you some of the artwork and draw your attention to some of the parts of the narrative story, tell you a bit about the key plot themes, and also give you some of my opinions around the writing and what I like about it. Book 7, the customary high quality leather bound book with the Imperial Aquila corners of doom, these metal corners, so it's a very sturdy book. It's got this fantastic depiction on the front. We open at the front cover. This is a sample of some of the very nice miniature scene computer mix art that we are all accustomed to with Forge World books. We have a red ribbon for marking the page, which is a nice feature as well, and something that I always found useful. So yes, nice scene setter here. The Space Wolves with their Mastodon transport assault the Thousand Suns in the ruins of Tisca. So, the opening statement, "Suffer not the witch to live, ancient Terran curse." And indeed, that is very much what this book is about, because it deals primarily with Magnus Sered and his abortive attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal. Let's take a look and see what this book contains. As is the case with all the Horus Heresy books, we have several sections. And the first section is the Fall of Prospero. This is a history of the events around the actual burning of Prospero. We then have a section that talks about the forces of the Imperium. So these are the Imperial units that make up what is called the censure host that is dispatched by the Emperor. And we have an examination here of some units that have never before been looked at in any part of the Games Workshop Warhammer 40,000 or Horus Heresy game. And these, of course, are the Legio Custodes and the Sisters of Silence, and then the Ordo Sinistra as well, from a Titan Legion perspective. Key thing about this book is we have some brand new units and some very important units from the lore examined in the first time. The next section is then the forces of Prospero. So this is the defenders of Prospero, and here we have the Thousand Suns, Legio, Zestabiax, and the forge and the Mechanicum Forge of Zal Arakad. That forms the history and the unit background, and that's 178 pages. So slightly, about 60% of the book, 65% of the book. We then have a developed narrative campaign, which is a Prospero campaign. We then have army list sections, and first we have the Thousand Suns Legion. We then have the Space Wolves Legion of Lehman Russ. The Talons of the Emperor, which is a combined force consisting of both the Legio Custodes, Sisters of Silence, and the Ordo Sinistra as well. So this is a brand new introduction to the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and the first time we've had a comprehensive set of rules dealing with the companions of the Emperor and his Sisters of Silence. We then have some new units for the Mechanicum list, not to be forgotten. And finally, the final section of this book deals with battles in the Age of Darkness, and that's the core missions for playing Horus Heresy era games. So let us begin, and let us start to work through this huge tome. This is the longest book so far by page count in the Horus Heresy series. I think is it 312 pages? Oh, sorry, 307. I think it goes a little bit further than that, but it's just a bit longer than the previous record holder. And let's see if that equates to more interesting content. So once again, we have the familiar preface by our semi-anonymous Imperial historian, AK. I suppose, what does this talk about? It sets the scene for the portentous events that are going to happen on Prospero. And it talks about the pride of Magnus Sered and his dabbling in what is referred to as sorcery or the psychic arts, but also the naivety of the Council of Terror and how they handled the situation as well. This sets up Magnus the Red and Prospero for a terrible disaster. The first section is called The Trial of the Sorcerer, and what we have here is a stepping back in imperial history. And actually, although this is book 7 in the Horus Heresy series, it actually chronologically is book 1 thus far. So the events of this book precede book 1 Betrayal by a couple of years. And what we do here is we take a step back in time and look at the origins of the Libraris project and Magnus the Red, and how the whole situation at Prospero developed. This first section here speculates as to the influence of Horus Lupercal on the events of Prospero, and we know from previously produced material that he did have a hand in this, and it, as well as his direct involvement in terms of the battle itself, it also talks about how he may have already been orchestrating a rebellion in the later part of the 31st millennium, or the final century of it. Is this Victor's history here, and looking at events that happened after the Horus Heresy and putting them in the context of Horus's later betrayal? Or is it actually identifying that Horus was planning his rebellion maybe 50 years before it actually happened? An interesting discussion. Here we have an excellent picture here. This is the city of Tizca, the principal city of Prospero and the seat of Magnus the Red's power and the Thousand Sons, and a very nice artistic depiction. Here we talk about, as was the case in book 5, Tempest, once again we examine the contradictions inherent to the imperial truth and how the secular rationalism of the emperor was at odds to some of the characteristics and natures of his son. And Magnus the Red was very conflicted, of course, through his investigation and powerful psychic powers. And it also talks about the origins of the Libraris project, which Magnus the Red was the leader of, and how the Primarchs themselves as a group were split on the subject of psychic powers, and in particular their use by the legions Astartes. Now here we have an examination of an important event in this story, which is the Council of Nicaea, and this was a council where the emperor met with the Primarchs and other key imperial agents and officials, and decided as to whether or not the Libraris project would continue and Space Marine Psychers were allowed to be used. And of course, you know, there's for those students of history out there, of course, this is a rewriting of the First Council of Nicaea of the early Christian Church, and very much in terms of what is debated here and discussed here, there's a real comparison with the Arian question of the Council of Nicaea. Nice bit of history blending there. Ultimately, it was decided the Emperor outlawed the use of psychers in the legions, and of course that was to have grave effects, and Magnus the Red was censured in a way not unlike that happened to Lorgar at the hands of Rabut Gulliman. There is a clear parallel there in terms of the effect on the legion. And there's a great little quote in here that is apparently verbatim from the Emperor, and this was in terms of underlying the gravity of his decision to outlaw the psychers, and it says, "I will visit such destruction on him and all his followers that, until the end of all things, he shall rue the day he turned from my light." Fascinating use of language there. Turned from my light. For someone who was a secular rationalist, not the sort rather quasi-religious language to use, I thought there. Of course, after this tumultuous event and in the years afterwards, Magnus, there was the portentous events of Davin when Horus was corrupted by the Chaos Gods. And of course Magnus intervened in that corruption to try stop Horus, and he was unsuccessful. Magnus then took it upon himself to try send an immediate psychic warning to the Emperor on the Earth. Unfortunately, by doing so, he ruptured the webway on Terra and led to a spilling forth of chaos entities into under parts of the Imperial Palace. And this is talked about here, although it is somewhat vaguely described as to what actually happened as a consequence of Magnus's warning, and the warning is not very well described either. And I think it's a shame that wasn't dealt with in more detail, because what happened, and I'll come back to this later in terms of the way the narrative develops. Of course, the emperor was incensed, and he issued a writ of censure against Magnus, and that is this here. And Leman Russ was made responsible for bringing Magnus back before the emperor on terror. And here we have the first of our depictions of a legionary of the Thousand Sons in their iconic metallic red armour. So that sets the scene, and the next section is mustering the host. And now, of course, the emperor has issued his writ of censure against Magnus the Red, and he needs it enforcing. And to do so, Captain General of the Legio Custodes, Constantin Valdor, is placed in charge of mustering a censure mission. However, Russ is given the authority to deal with Magnus directly. So an interesting division of command responsibility, you may say. A large host is assembled of the Space Wolves, a significant detachment of the Custodian Guard, a large number of Sisters of Silence, and then also a number of Titans from the Ordo Sinister, which are Imperial Psyker Titans, which is a new unit. The force is assembled on Terra in terms of the Custodians, the Sisters of Silence, and their supporting Imperial Auxilia and Army units. The Wolves, however, are on campaign, and they will join later. And it's interesting at this point, this made me speculate as to why the Wolves were chosen to censure Magnus, or not even to censure him, but to go fetch him and bring him back to the Emperor. Now, for those of you who know the lore, the Space Wolves have a history of it being this Emperor's enforcers against wayward legions. Not all the time, but on occasions. And there's a famous incident with the World Eaters where Russ is sent to teach Angron a lesson, which is ultimately unsuccessful. However, you do question why the Space Wolves were chosen for this mission, given their destructive nature and also Leman Russ's enmity towards Magnus the Red. Of all the Primarchs to send to fetch Magnus and bring him back to Terra, was not Russ the worst possible choice? And that's something that isn't really necessarily addressed in this history. However, it's not just the Custodians, the Wolves and the Sisters and their supporting army who go. Horus intervenes and attaches a detachment of his Sons of Horus Legion and also the Legio Mortis Titan Legion, and they have a somewhat bellicose influence on the war host. And it is noted that Constantin Valdor is concerned by this attitude and how it starts to influence Leman Russ and perhaps fire his ire even more than may otherwise existed. So the host goes to Prospero, and then the next section of the book actually talks about the attack on Prospero itself. Magnus the Red doesn't give any bellicose standing towards the arrival of the fleet as it enters the system, so there's no defence or anything like that. Another nice picture of Tisca starting. I'm not sure if this is depicting it being initially under attack here. We have a map of the city of Tisca, and it also gives dispositions of the landing forces when the Wolves do attack, supported eventually by the Custodians. Similar to in the earlier section when we had a list of all the attackers, or the censure fleet, we have a list of the detail in terms of who was defending Prospero itself as well. Several months passed from when Magnus tried to make his warning to the actual arrival of the censure fleet on Prospero. So, some time had passed, and Magnus the Red had very much been in seclusion for this time, realising the grave error he'd committed. He very much left it to his own troops to organise the running of the city, and in particular, the Ahriman is significant there as one of their principal officers, as well as the Thousand Sons. There's a funny note here to say it was also defended by what they've called a Free Corps, and that's clearly a play on the post-World War I German militias, a Free Corps. The censure fleet overwhelms the system defences in the Prospero system. We're unopposed, and once in orbit around Prospero, Russ issues a challenge to Magnus to give himself up, and he's given 1 hour to do so. At the end of that hour, no response occurs, and that failure to acknowledge the message was to have disastrous consequences. Then we move to the next section of the history, and this is the fall of Tisca. And indeed, this deals with the whole of the planetary battle of Prospero. Russ's response to Magnus's failure to acknowledge his message is utterly savage and somewhat base, and he unleashes the firepower of his fleet on the planet. And in an act of savagery, almost paralleled by Horus's virus bombing of Isstvan III, he unleashes a whole host of prescribed weapons on the planet, including huge quantities of phosphex bombing with this, and the planet is utterly devastated, and any population outside of Tisca is wiped out. And as it is said, Prospero is reduced to ash. However, Tisca is protected by an extremely strong psionic defense matrix called the Kine, and that protects it from the worst ravages of the bombardment. And we've got fantastic, I mean, this is so there's some great artwork in this book as well. You know, this depiction here of the custodians and the wolves starting to move through Tisca is very, very nicely executed. Following the bombardment, the censure host makes planetfall at Tisca. They completely overwhelmed their defences and their defending militia. The wolves systematically start crushing the defenders of Tisca, and the reason they crush the defenders so thoroughly to start with is because the Thousand Suns are nowhere to be seen. This is a colour plate of the inside jacket cover with this Space Wolf Mastodon disgorging its troops to attack these Thousand Suns. We have a rare appearance of a rotor cannon here, the weapon of champions. The wolves secure the city and they kill all defending militia and others before them without any mercy whatsoever. Although it does note that those who try to flee, which is the civilians, are allowed to run away, although that's scant mercy given the fact they've already phosphex bombed the entire planet. It's hardly merciful if you look at it in that context. However, the Space Wolves are then ambushed when the Thousand Suns Astartes finally stir into action and attack them. Of course, when the Thousand Suns attack, they don't just attack as a normal Marine Legion, they unleash their psionic power as well. And this has devastating effects on the wolves, and you know, hundreds and hundreds of Space Wolves are killed in moments by the ferocity of this ambush. However, the full might of the Thousand Suns is not being brought to bear because their Primarch, the most powerful Psyker in the galaxy after the Emperor, is nowhere to be seen. So Ahriman is leading the defence. The battle intensifies between the Thousand Suns and the Space Wolves, and it's a furious battle, and the Thousand Suns begin to unleash more and more of their psionic powers, and this starts to destabilise the situation for the Space Wolves in the city. At that point, Constantin Valdor, who is still in orbit, decides to intervene to prevent all going against the wolves and turning the operation into a disaster. The battle becomes truly terrible indeed at this point, with the Thousand Suns joining the battle. And Ahriman becomes desperate at this point, and he sacrifices huge numbers of thralls in the main temple to give them prescience. And this prescience, by leeching the psychic power out of these poor unfortunates, allows Ahriman to guide the Thousand Suns, and although they're outnumbered, it amplifies the effect of their troops. So the fight is not as one-sided as numbers would suggest. However, at this point, perhaps the greatest asset in this battle, which is the Sisters of Silence and the Ordo Sinister, are out of the fight, and they've been almost kept out through communication interference. So the most powerful weapon for the Space Wolves at this point, held out the way. However, Valdor does manage to make planetfall with his custodians and a sizable contingent of the Sisters available, and they take the Thousand Suns on in a savage battle. Another turn of events then happens in the battle, and again this is linked to the psionic capabilities of the Thousand Suns, and the old inner Titan, Canis Vertex, is brought psychically to life, essentially through creating a small warp rift within it. And of course the introduction of this psionically motivated Titan wreaks devastation on the Space Wolves and the Custodians. However, all this psychic power being unleashed by the Thousand Suns can only go so far, and they then start to experience the curse of a flesh change without restraint, and this is an old curse of the Thousand Suns, and yes, they begin to mutate and turn into all sorts of horrific warp entities. However, it's not just the Thousand Suns who experience the mutating effects of a warp. The Space Wolves as well are affected, and a number of their warriors are reduced to a base state of something like the Wolfen. So yes, both of the legions start to be twisted by the effects of chaos. We then move into the next section of the history, which is called the Impossible Battle, and this is the very much the accumulation of the assault on Tisca. Communication with the surface is lost at this point due to the psionic storm, and also the final destruction of Canis Vertex, the psychically imbued Titan. With the ebb and flow of battle and the tumultuous events that are happening, the Thousand Suns suddenly start to abandon their psychic power because of the terrible damage that the flesh change has wreaked on them. And this section here, the Dark Wolves, or the Wolf's Dark Legacy, talks about the origin of a Wolfen being at this point of the battle. And here we see a horrific transformation occurring. We don't know if it's a Space Wolf or a Thousand Sun, and the normal Legion is turning against it to try and bring it down. So the censure host is closing in, and then Magnus makes himself known. And the battle moves to the central temple, and Magnus engages Russ in combat. And this is described as being a duel between the two Primarchs, and everyone else stays out of the way. Even the Custodians don't get involved. At the height of battle, Russ kills Magnus, or at least he thinks it is, and it is at that moment that Magnus's body, many of his legionnaires, and a whole host of other civilians in the temple simply vanish. And there is a huge disruption of chaos that ensues. So even in their moment of victory, the censure host face a terrible after effect. The destruction in Prospero was very great. Some Thousand Suns and civilians did actually escape, led by the officer Sul Contep. In the aftermath of the apparent death of Magnus the Red and the victory of the Wolves, the true carnage in the city of Tisca, because of course remember the whole planet's being firebombed, being phosphate bombed, but the true carnage begins in Tisca, and the Sons of Horus make themselves known at this point, and they start to move through the city, rounding up civilians and executing people, and very much unrestrained and with their own mission. The Fifth Fellowship of the Thousand Suns escape. Following this is this section here which talks about the bloody tally of justice. There are, as is often the case with legions, there were 1,000 Suns on campaign throughout many parts of the growing Imperium, and after the events of Prospero, they were announced traitors and they were slaughtered by their accompanying legionnaires. So the Ultramarines wipe out a force, and the Emperor's children do as well. So the carnage on the Thousand Suns is not just limited to those who are on Prospero. It affects them all over the galaxy. At the end of the battle, the Space Wolves have taken heavy losses, very heavy losses, and much greater than they would have expected. The Custodians lost many troops, and the first time that the Custodians have really been shown to be mortal in a way and take significant casualties, and many Sisters of Silence, many Sisters of Silence were also killed as well. However, the historian Riley observes how efficient the Custodians were at killing Adeptus Astartes of the Thousand Suns, and notes is that their true purpose in the Empire, to act as a way of destroying Space Marines. So, and that is the end of the cataclysmic battle, or the description of a cataclysmic battle of Prospero. The next section, which is the Seeds of Heresy, this looks beyond the Battle of Prospero and into the intervening couple of years before the Isstvan III Atrocity and the beginning of Horus's open rebellion. And there are some portentous events that happen here. Firstly is Leman Russ shares his experience of anti-Space Marine tactics with Horus. Leman Russ shares his experience of fighting other Space Marines, the Omega Codex with Horus, and that was going to be a benefit to Horus when he started his rebellion, in having tactical knowledge of how to fight other Space Marines. Now, you would have thought with such an amazing victory, this would have been well received, and openly it is. However, the Emperor is very cool with the outcome, and it was not the destruction of Prospero and the death of Magnus the Red is not what he wanted to happen. And those of you who know a bit more about what the purpose of all the Primarchs were and the Emperor's plan was thought to be, the loss of Magnus the Red meant he had lost the Psyker, who was probably going to sit on the Golden Throne long term in the Astronomicon. So that was before the Horus Heresy even began, this was a massive blow to the Emperor's plan for the future of the human Imperium. There's enormous diplomatic fallout of the Battle of Prospero. There are many worlds who had been brought to Imperial compliance by the Thousand Suns, who were put into a state of unrest by their destruction. And also Horus was slighted as well by the whole operation. Even as War Master, the Emperor had chosen Leman Russ, a fellow Primarch, to carry out this most important of tasks against Magnus the Red. So there was a slight to Horus as well. So, and did that play into his ultimate betrayal? Very nice picture of a Knight Porphyrion there. So this is good. And this kind of just sets the scene a little bit for, I suppose, the aftermath of Prospero, and then the run-up to Isstvan III. And that concludes the story of Prospero, and then we move into the background for the forces involved in the battle. And the first section deals with the forces of the Imperium. And from the start, we deal with the Space Wolves, who are described as being savage from the start and also separate from other legions. So they read, in terms of their savagery, they read like the World Eaters, and you might argue there was not much to separate the two legions, but they were certainly kept separate from other legions and did their own thing. I wonder if someone had seen the trailer for The Force Awakens when they did that piece of artwork. So yes, this section is Legion history for the Space Wolves, and we get a description of the origins of the Legion, their early actions, the homeworld of their Primarch, and the effect of reuniting their Primarch with the Legion as well. I'm going to move through this section fairly quickly, and we're going to look at the Thousand Suns in greater detail, and then we get iconography. And as we've been going through, you get lots of these nice illustrations of various warriors, which are full of great ideas for paint schemes and iconography. if you're painting and modelling that particular force. And then, as well as their history in terms of their origins and their growth, we also get a selection of exemplary battles that they fought in the Great Crusade. Of course, the Space Wolves has got a very unique, distinct look. Well, you know, they're Norse in space, or space Vikings, aren't they, really? And a couple of their vehicles. They have a very, interestingly, with the Space Wolf Legion, at the time of the Heresy, they have a very dark grey armour, and this was to change and become much lighter in the later years of the Imperium. And they almost have a very pale grey in the 41st millennium. There's a mighty Sokar patterned stormbird. As I mentioned in the description of the Battle of Prospero, Horus attached his own forces to the battle, and it seems that one of the things they were doing, as well as rounding up prisoners from Prospero, was to observe and document tactical styles for fights between Astartes. It's nice to go back to one of the legions from the original book, Book 1, Betrayal, and to have these revisited with some up-to-date artwork. House Malinax was attached to the force as well. Of course, Malinax was later to side with Horus in the Heresy. And then here's a depiction of a Legio Mortis Warlord Titan, Cadavaris Pedita. And for those of you who own a Warlord Titan, you might recognise this artwork from the instruction book to that incredible resin kit. This is nice. This is a new depiction of a Warhound Titan for the Heresy books. That's a smudge. That wasn't. I did that. That's not part of the book. So I like that because it had a side-on view that didn't look quite as good, and I like this new aspect they've done for showing warhounds. And then we move to the Legio Custodes. So fascinating. For the first time ever, we have a detailed description and rule set for the Emperor's companions. And this starts off by talking about their origins. So, you know, a couple of interesting things that I found here. I mean, they are said to predate both the Thunder Warriors and the Space Marines. So the Custodians go right back to the start of the Emperor's conquest of Terra, and possibly even before that. They're described as being about 10,000 strong. So, you know, if you imagine there are about 1 million Marines, there are 10,000 Custodians, so a significant difference in numbers. And they're described as being mightier than the Space Marines, but however less adaptable. But of course that reflects their purpose, doesn't it, as well? Now, there's one interesting bit of lore in here that I don't know, I'd certainly not read before, and I don't know if anyone else has come across this in any of the history, and I'll be interested to know. But it talks a bit here about a question that has often cropped up. And it actually says here that Space Marines and Adeptus Custodes have been engineered so they are incapable of procreation to avoid, well, the distraction, shall we say, to them, and to give them singular purpose. So they are very, you know, when you hear about things being transhuman, well, yes, they are no longer human, certainly from that regard. And you can imagine them as being a little bit like warrior eunuchs in effect, through different purposes. But yeah, I've not seen this stated so explicitly in Games Workshop lore before of any kind, so that fascinated me, that did. There are interesting contrasts here between how the Marines are created through the implantation of the 18 or is it 19 organs that makes a Space Marine, you know, such as the black carapace. However, the Custodians are entirely gene crafted and are potentially also crafted through the use of psychic biomancy as well, so a very different creation process. Now we've got a depiction of a Custodian with a Guardian Spear in their distinctive golden armour with all of its iconic filigree, and a very nice image of a Contemptor Achilles Dreadnought. Very, I love the lighting on this one. The artist did a great job on that. Nice little note in here for fans of the old lore. It is noted that Arkham Land, famous originator of the Land Raider and Land Speeder, was a person who retrieved the technology that was to be used in the Custodes and Sisters of Silence grav vehicles. And here we have a depiction of my favourite custodian armoured transport, the Coronis. And then we move to talking about the Sisters of Silence. So the Sisters of Silence are another arm of the Emperor, shall we say. This gives us background to the part of what the Sisters of Silence are about. The control and capture of psychics throughout the Imperium. And we talk about here the Astronomicon, the Great Tithe Black Ships, what the origins of Sisterhood was. I mean, apparently they came along later than the Custodians and the Space Marines, and were involved to something called the Cataclysm of Pentacanes, which was a psychic incursion. Neat little sort of a camera capture of what's called the Sisters of Silence dedicated transport, the Charon, which is a great looking vehicle. Now the Sisterhood are interesting again. They are all psychic nulls, so they have the pariah gene. They are psychic blanks in the void. They are immune to the effects of the warp. They can't be possessed, all those things. They're entirely female, and it's not fully explained why. So the Sisters of Silence truly are silent. They take a vow of silence, and they do not talk. And they communicate via a sign language of various kinds, and they know sign language is used by other forces of the Imperium as well. And I was reading this and I couldn't help but think of the Bene Gesserit from Frank Herbert's novel Dune, and they've clearly been modelled on that idea. Their style of combat is very different. They fight at close range, and again that benefits the effect of their psychic null radius. And also the Sisters of Silence are unaugmented troops, so either through gene craft or organ implantation, Sisters of Silence are natural humans. So a real contrast to the Custodians and the Adeptus Astartes that have been genetically and possibly psychically modified as well. A little bit of discussion around the pariah gene here as to its origins. I think this bit was a little bit too vague for me. I'd have liked it to be a little bit more specific to understand what the pariah gene was. Although it does note that no Custodian or Astartes has ever been a null, so it's purely the Sisters of Silence. In the final section on the forces of the Talons of the Emperor is the Ordo Sinister, or the left hand of the Emperor, or the Nightmare Titans, and these are the psionic titans. So truly terrible war machines and terrifying war machines. To imagine a warlord titan with psychic mastery. Again, some great artwork here. I'm sure this is tapping into some of the artwork they're doing for Adeptus Titanicus at the moment. I like this picture. This is you don't often see warlords armed this way, so you've got the Mars Beta pattern head, and then also the multi-launchers on this guy, which is a nice change to the usual laser blasters and standard heads you see depicted in these books. So moving to the force, so that is the forces of the Talons of the Emperor. Now we move to the forces of Prospero, and first and foremost is the Sons of Magnus the Red, the Thousand Sons. It's nice to see an actual line art drawing. This talks about the origins of the 15th Legion. It's very slow initial growth, its origins. There's interesting speculation here as to why the Thousand Sons were created as such a potent psychic legion, because it clearly wasn't an accident. The Emperor made them that way. However, the very design posed enormous hazards given human frailties and vulnerabilities to the warp. It discusses the origins of the flesh curse, the flesh change, which is the incident on Bensound. Sounds a bit Byzantine, doesn't it? Where the unfortunate Deleth experienced the first transfiguration, and following that, more and more legionnaires started to succumb to to this terrible flesh change, and the legion started to shrink in size because this couldn't be controlled. Very unusually, I found, in terms of what was happening, although the Thousand Sons were experiencing these horrific flesh change events and basically warp, the legionnaires being overwhelmed by the warp when using their psychic powers, and it being known, the Emperor didn't intervene or take censure against them. We then talk about how, with the discovery of Magnus the Red on the planet of Prospero, reuniting with his Astartes brothers, that he affected he psychically healed them and stopped the flesh change, which again was interesting, that it was left to Magnus the Red to do this and not the Emperor, who was a more powerful psyker. The Emperor left it to Magnus to heal his sons. And of course, then they begin to rebuild and grow in strength as a legion. This section talks about again some more detail about the origins of the Librarius project, which was Magnus's brainchild, and it also starts to get into some of this organisation around the Thousand Sons. So this is part of it. They have several cults, and these actually have an effect on the game. And just as is the case with the Space Wolves, the Thousand Sons have got a very unusual and intriguing force organisation. So if you're wanting to play unusual legions, and this is certainly the book to go for. Get some more information about the orders, their structure, the orders. The Thousand Sons have got a very complex organisation, and it's not hierarchical in a traditional sense. And indeed, it's actually described as being like an ever-changing pyramid. Makes you think of could be a pyramid scheme. I can think of some other cults in history that have had a pyramid scheme, shall we say. Anyway, so, and then we also have a description of their exemplary battles as well, and a unique unit, the Thousand Sons Castellax Achaea Battle Automata. This is ultimate tech heresy. This is, from a Mechanicum's point of view, this is kind of like a battle robot with a psychic spirit. I don't know if outside of this, the Battle of Prospero, if you could really use these. Most of the Thousand Sons were wiped out, so, but I suspect we will find that some of those escaped. And then we get some depictions of Thousand Sons legionaries, including this guy here, who's a very early Thousand Son, and what a contrasting and different paint scheme to what they ultimately adopted. I always like in these books when we get to see what the Legion originally looked like before being reunited with their Primarchs. So yeah, lots of painting ideas and insignia ideas as well. Very, the high quality artwork that we're kind of accustomed to with these books. Then we move on to a section about the what was a forge world of Zar Arkad, which is a forge world that was brought into compliance by the Thousand Sons and was the ultimate source of their psychic Castellax. So, and this is a little bit, puts me in mind a little bit of the Zana compliance and Zana forge world from book 6, which is quite an autonomous Mechanicum holdout, shall we say. They strike a close pact with this particular forge world, and they then develop the psychic robots for them. A couple of cool Mechanicum robots. Very nice Domitar there, looking very Egyptian in those colours, I think. Then we have Legio Zestiobax, which is a Titan Legion that was stationed on Prospero and fought alongside the Thousand Sons, although they were a small legion and they were overwhelmed. And that concludes all of a section on the history and the unit backgrounds. Yes, a big section, 184 pages in total, so a lot of lore and history to get your teeth into there. We then have a narrative campaign, so this is a Prospero campaign. Interesting note here, as this book precedes book 1, it is quite right to point out there are no traitors at this stage. So if you want to expand the scope of your game and introduce some other legions into Prospero battles, you can include any character of that time. So if you could take a traitor character, say for example from the Sons of Horus from book 1 or book 2, and introduce them here as a loyalist, which is an interesting suggestion. And much in the same way as other campaigns from the Horus Heresy books and narrative campaigns, you've got several phases to this campaign, 3 phases, each of which, so you fight a series of battles, try to achieve victory points, and then at the end of each phase you have a legendary battle, which denotes a particularly significant event. There you go. So yeah, legendary missions. So yeah, if you want to play the campaign, you've got a great campaign, a great amount of detail to play through there. A nice fur pelt on this Space Marine Legionary. So yes, so that is a campaign section, and then we move into the army list appendices, and there are quite a lot of the army lists in this particular book. So firstly we have the Thousand Sons, so we have Legion specific rules for these guys, of which there are quite a lot. There are lots and lots, and particularly lots of rules around their psionic capabilities. We get 2 rights of war, and then we also get their Castellax Achaea battle automata rules. I imagine these are going to be very popular with Thousand Sons players. We get their Legion specific units, heroes including Azek Ahriman, one of the most prominent of Thousand Son characters, and of course he works all the way down to the 40k era. Magistus Aemon, nice picture, nice work Forge Order, want more of those. And then finally Magnus Sered, and we get a cheeky little look at the upcoming miniature here. And Magnus Sered at 495 points is one of the is second in points cost only to Horus, and that is on account, I'm sure, of him being a Mastery level 5 Psyker. So then we get the Space Wolves army list. Again, probably more so than any other legion, these guys have got the most unusual and distinct army list in the heresies thus far. I mean, one of the key things is their compulsory troop choices are not tactical marines. They have their own unique standard troop type, which is this Grey Slayer pack. Then we get their heroes, Priest of Fenris, and then Leman Russ, their Savage Primarch. I'll come back to my thoughts on Leman Russ and how he's depicted in this book at the end. I can't admit the artist needed to put a little bit more prominence on his teeth. He looks a bit like he's sticking his tongue out, I always think. Which is a shame because it's an otherwise excellent picture. Now, the first truly new army list section to this book, which is the Talons of the Emperor. And after many years of existence of a 40k lore and universe, we now have a set of rules to cover the Custodian Guard. And I imagine for many people this will be the reason they buy this book, for this army list. And if you were hoping that the Custodians were going to come with a lot of esoteric and sophisticated weapons, you won't be disappointed, because they are certainly packing, shall we say. Then we have the Sisters of Silence, and the Sisters of Silence are a nice counter to the super elite Custodians themselves, and it allows you to play a Talons of the Emperor force with some lower cost units than the Custodians themselves, so it makes the army list nice and scalable and doesn't always force you into very, very expensive infantry options. And the Sisters of Silence get a whole host of war gear as well, and one of the things with the Talons of the Emperor list is there are a lot of special rules that go around them. But I think that's generally the case of all of the forces in this book. They're certainly not beginner armies as far as the Horus Heresy goes, I would say. We get the rules for the Captain General Constantine Valdor, the mightiest warrior in the Imperium, second after the Primarchs. We get Janita Crow, who is noted as being the most reliable witness at the events of the Central Temple in the Battle of Tisca. Because as a psychic null, she and her fellow sisters who survived were the only people who probably truly had an accurate recollection of what happened in that temple. Yeah, and the Custodian army list is a very rich army list. There's a whole host of different custodians and sister squads, so you have a huge variety of troops available. You also have vehicles as well. I mean, we have their hovering Land Raider equivalent, the Coronis Grav Carrier. Well, perhaps not quite as tough as Land Raider, but has unique abilities. I like this. This is giving us gamers and modelers a bit of an idea to say, well, you know, if you don't like the idea of having lots of golden bananas, as they sometimes get called, why not go for a different paint scheme for your custodians? And this guy in this ash grey or black paint scheme, I think looks really good, and that's a paint scheme I would go for. And then we get the Charon Pattern Acquisitor, which is the Sisters of Silence dedicated transport. Here, posing as Shai Hulud, again a second Dune reference in this book. Although no mention of worm sign. And another picture, another one of the fantastic Forge World illustrations of the vehicles, and this is a Pallas Gravatak, which is like a hovering light tank. Big army list. I'm still working my way through all the options here for the custodians. And finally, we get the most expensive unit yet in Warhammer 40,000 or the Horus Heresy, which is the Warlord Sinister Pattern Battle Psi Titan, coming in at a mere 3,250 points. What happens when you cross a Psyker with a Warlord Titan? Goodness me. Very nice picture of a Custodian Contemptor Dreadnought, Contemptor Galatus. And again, I don't know what they did differently with these, but the way they did the lighting, I just think it gives them a certain photorealism. And then finally we have some more Mechanicum troops. So we finally get the rules for the Secutarii Titan Guard. So these guys have been out for a long time. We've had rules in 40k, but we're only just now getting them for the Heresy, so that's a welcome addition to the Mechanicum list. Because these guys are sort of like been missing because they've got some really important abilities to support Titans, and to include a large Titan, particularly something like a Reaver or a Warlord in your force, having some of these guys really buffs it up if it needs buffing up. But they act as supporting troops, so it's good to get these guys. And then this is from the 2017 weekend. This was previewed, the Karakanos assault tank. So this is basically a modified Triaros with a host of Phosphex dispensers. Everybody's favourite or least favourite flying robot, the Vultarax, not to be confused with a Blight drone. And finally, the Acastus Knight Porphyrion. So, yeah, the awesome new knight that's almost a full-size Titan. And then the final section of the book takes us back to very familiar ground for the Horus Heresy, and we have the Battles in the Age of Darkness core missions again. These have cropped up in every book thus far. It just gives you that basic game styles to play, and a few of the Primarch models, the other books. And that brings us to the end. And where's our little afterword? Come on, Forge World. Where's our afterword? In every single Horus Heresy book to date, there's been an afterword that was written by the design studio. And just a nice little talk about what the book was about, thanking all the fans, and also giving us a little tease for what's to come. And they left it out on this one, and I think that's a shame. So, yeah. I think we need that back in the future. And there you have it, a cover-to-cover review of Horus Heresy Book 7, Inferno. So, what do I think of this enormous tome? I mean, it's certainly this is a big book and it's got a lot of content. So what do I think about the Horus Heresy Book 7? I think it depends on what you want as to whether or not you're going to like this book. So I guess first from a point of view of, I can imagine for Thousand Suns players and the Space Wolves players, you know, this book is all about your Legion, and you know, I can imagine it's going to be just lapped up for that, and you know, you're really going to love it. And having looked at the army list for those two legions, they look absolutely fascinating army list to play, and with a great amount of individuality as well. Likewise, if you're interested in the custodians, then this book, you know, it's a must buy, isn't it? Because, you know, it has a custodian army list for the first time. I suppose, you know, as of producing this review, March 2017, we may well get a red book army list for the custodians at some point, and they're supporting troops. So there might be an option in the future but we don't have it yet, but there could be an option for that. You know, there's a few additions to the Mechanicum list. If you're interested in playing the actual story of Prospero, which I imagine will be quite a big draw, you know, you've got a well-developed and thorough campaign in the narrative campaign section as well, so that's good. What I'm a bit more divided on in terms of my own personal opinion with this book is the actual story writing in it. And this is for a couple of reasons. So the first thing is, reading the story, it feels like a rerun of Book 5 Tempest, with the Battle of Calth. And it does feel like a regurgitation of that story in a way, and it's not as well written either. And there's also a slight problem as well in terms of a narrative enjoyment there, because, and you may remember at the start of my review I said how the causes of the Emperor sending Rus to send Jean Magnus weren't very well explained in terms of the Webway incursion. And I think as a self-contained read, I found it difficult to connect or like the Rus and the forces of the Imperium in this, because they actually they kind of like commit a terrible planetary genocide in this, and there isn't, I don't know, it just doesn't seem to make enough sense as to why that happened for it to have happened. I think in a bit more filling out of a story around the Webway incursion would have set the scene better, because you actually, I mean, I read this and at the end of it I thought the Space Wolves were absolutely horrific, and I thought they were as bad as a world, you know, they read as bad as a World Eaters in terms of their barbarism and savagery. So I don't know, maybe that was the intention of the writers, I'm not sure, but as an enjoyable book to read in the history, it didn't connect with me in the same way that say Book 5 did or Book 6. So yeah, I'm in mixed opinions on that, but I don't know if it was intended or not, so that's kind of like just a personal view as to what I felt. So, but there's some interesting snippets of Imperial history, and I guess this is the fact this is a prequel book as well that goes before the events of Isstvan. It also brings something new to the table there. But it's kind of, I suppose it's a bit more of a specialist niche compared to the later books in terms of the story they tell. So I think I've got a bit mixed opinions on the story in this one compared to the preceding books. So yeah, I hope that's some useful advice if you're thinking about getting this book as to whether or not it's one for you. But as I said, I imagine Thousand Suns, Space Wolves, and potential Talons of the Emperor players are gonna, you know, obviously this is got some great background for those guys. Anyway, that's been a long review of a long book, so I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. I'll speak to you next time, and goodbye.